which is held April 23rd through the 29th. Anyone who makes a donation to FFRPL of $5 or more for today through the end of the month can choose a free copy of one of the 3 beautiful coffee table books that you saw on your way in. Donations can be made online or in person at the FFRPL bookstore in the space just adjacent to this auditorium, and the store will be open until 3 p.m. today. Funds raised with this offer will be applied toward the Harold Hacker Advancement of Libraries Endowed Fund, and FFRPL will then grant eligible libraries from across 5 counties money from the fund in support of 2 primary causes: to further education and professional development for librarians and library staff, and to further innovative projects and programs. And we thank you in advance for any support that you might be able to provide. According to Forbes magazine, when companies focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, many often start with gender. Since today's book review will be related to gender, gender roles, and gender expression, we wanted to remind everyone of some of the DEI initiatives at FFRPL and the library, which specifically address issues of DEI related to both gender and sexuality. FFRPL helped fund, promote, and present Stonewall, 50 Years Out, the 2019 historical exhibition created by Central Library's Local History and Genealogy Division in partnership with key stakeholders in the LGBTQIA community and the community at large. We manage the Equality Fund for Humanity and Enlightenment to supplement library resources, programs, and materials in pursuit of a world free of discrimination and to promote education and equality of opportunity for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, queer, intersex, and asexual people. And we also steward the Evelyn Bailey Shoulders to Stand On Endowed Fund to provide staff and resources to preserve and promote the history of Rochester's LGBTQIA community. Today's review is of the book Before We Were Trans, A New History of Gender by Kit Heyam, a groundbreaking history of gender nonconformity that includes stories from people across the globe whose experiences of gender defy binary categories. And our reviewer today is Aditi Fruitwala, staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union for Liberty. And will you please join me in welcoming Aditi to our podium.
Hello, everyone. Wow, this is a packed house. It's really good to be here. My name is Aditi Fruitwala. My pronouns are she and her. And I am a staff attorney at the ACLU Center for Liberty, where I do LGBTQ, gender equity, and reproductive justice work. And what that work has looked like, I've been doing that work for about 6 years, and what it's looked like has changed quite a bit in the last 6 years. And in the last few years, we've had a real focus on trans justice out of necessity, particularly in the LGBTQ world. Is this better? Great. Particularly when we look at LGBTQ rights. How's that? Is that okay? All right. There's been a real focus on trans justice because that's where the attacks are that's where the attacks are occurring, and we're seeing that across the country. And so I'm really excited to talk about this book. I do want to give a personal disclaimer that I am not trans or gender nonconforming, and so I'm going to stick pretty closely to the text of the book because I don't want to speak for other people's experiences. And afterwards, I'm happy to answer any questions and also talk about my own work if folks want to know more. So to start us off, what are we talking about when we talk about trans history? So in the book, Kit starts off by giving one, I think, really good example of why this is complicated. So I'm actually just going to give the same example. Kit tells a story in the 1800s of someone named John Sullivan in London who was arrested because they were drunk on the street wearing women's clothing. And they were arrested for theft of women's clothing. And in court, they testified that they didn't steal the clothes, it was from a friend, they were just drunk and, and just having a really fun time. And it is impossible for us sitting here today to know whether that's true or not. It's entirely possible that they were drunk and just having a good time. This was the only time that they wore women's clothing. It's possible that they regularly wore women's clothing but didn't identify as trans or any other type of different gender than what they were born with. It's also possible that they would identify as what we understand today as trans, but we have absolutely no way of knowing. Right? And part of that is because we don't have records. Part of that is because the idea of trans is very, very new. The name transvestite didn't come into being until 1910, and what it was understood to be at that time was just cross-dressing, just dressing as a different gender. Transsexual didn't occur until the mid-1900s, and that was someone who accessed medical treatment to change their sex. And the word transgender did not happen until 1960s, and that's someone who transitioned in a number of ways. It could be socially, it could be medically, it could be otherwise. And so if you think about, really, we don't have a solid understanding of trans history until the 1960s, though we know what we would understand today as trans people existed throughout time and throughout cultures. And so that's what this book is sort of attempting to grapple with, and the introduction makes clear isn't doing it cleanly, because they can't do it cleanly. Because in order to know whether someone was truly trans, we have to know who they were, we have to know their motivations, and we have no way of knowing that in 2023. We also, the way that trans is defined today is tied to legal definitions, it's tied to medical definitions, but legal laws have changed throughout time, and so what people were prosecuted for 100 years ago, 200 years ago, would look really different than what they might be prosecuted for today regarding their gender. And medical records also look really different. And the most important way it looks different with regards to trans issues is that the way that we talk about gender identity today is what someone was assigned at birth. We say you were assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth, but those birth assignments didn't even happen until the 1800s. And so we don't have medical records before that that say what anyone was assigned at birth. So those are some complications with talking about who is and isn't trans. Another is that sex and gender isn't today and has never been stable. People think about themselves in different ways at different times in their lives. There's also not good records, because there's not good records at these times generally and intentionally. People were not public when they were trans, oftentimes. And so we don't have like diaries even of people saying, this is how I identify. So there's very few records here of what trans history looks like, which is why this book is really particularly important, because Kit is kind of scouring, scouring art and the little history that we do have and looking at like literary figures and just trying to piece together what might look like trans as we understand it today. And so the way that they define it is very broad. Kit defines trans in this book as anyone who doesn't identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. Anne talks about AMAB and AFAB, assigned male at birth and assigned female at birth. So I've kind of separated this presentation as first we're going to cover some examples of different cultures in different times that have thought about gender expansively or thought about gender differently than we would today. And then we're going to talk about some of the themes to pull from those cultures, and then a couple of the conflicts that exist today when we talk about trans identity in conjunction with other types of identities. So the first, Egypt in the 15th century. So one very famous queen slash king from that time was Hatshepsut. I remember learning about Hatshepsut in school. And Hatshepsut first ruled as a queen with their half-sibling. And their half-sibling was young, I think under the age of 7, and Hatshepsut was much older, and so rose to power quickly, seized power, and then was anointed as a pharaoh. And a pharaoh in Egypt was necessarily male. They were a god on earth, and so the fact that they had that particular power formed a new religious mythology, because a pharaoh was a king of gods, and a king was male. And so from that point on, you would, in the beginning of Hatshepsut's life, you would see them being depicted more as female presenting. And towards the end, you would see them presented as more of male presenting. But in the middle, there was this really interesting mix where you would see some breasts, but also a beard. You would see red skin, which was traditionally depicted, which was traditional for men, and yellow skin, which was traditional for women. And you would see both in the same statue. So as their reign progressed, they, either by choice or by how they were perceived, were depicted more and more as male. And when they had a child, they made sure that that was true for their child as well. And it's our understanding that their child was assigned female at birth, but in the early statues, their child has a beard to indicate that their child is also male. So because gender was inseparable from their social role, they were a pharaoh, and thus they were male. And so it's impossible to know whether Hatshepsut internally felt male or whether they were performing as a male in order to be a pharaoh. Just as one of many examples of how it's really hard to go back and really know whether someone would identify as trans or not. So Nigeria, Igbo society before the 19th century. Gender roles were separated as, there were gender roles in this society. Women worked the land and men performed ritual roles. However, their gender was not assigned at birth. Their gender was directly tied to the roles that they were performing. So if you worked the land, you were a woman. And if you performed ritual roles, you were a man. And your gender could shift depending on what role you were embodying at the time. You could also become a man in a couple of different ways. It could be performing ritual roles. It could also be through land ownership and through marriage. And so a man was someone who married a woman, and whatever children that woman had was the man's child. But there was no concept of sexual and romantic relationships within a marriage. And so the woman could be having, could have sex with someone else, have a child, and still be married to what we would consider today someone assigned female at birth, someone who's a woman. And so because their gender assignment was just depending on the gender role that they performed, it was extremely fluid. This changed, and you're gonna hear this quite often in this presentation. This changed during colonialism. During British invasion of Igbo land in the 1840s, they brought Christian missionaries who formed a new religion and new practices and banned indigenous deities and indigenous practices. And so in the kind of the new formulation of Nigeria, people who were assigned male at birth had political and economic power. People who were assigned female at birth did not. There was no way to switch. There was no way to move genders by changing your gender role. So in Japan, in the 1600s through 1800s, it was typical for men who lived in villages to move to the city of Tokyo, and for jobs and for other reasons. And in the city of Tokyo, they had access to kind of three categories of people for sex. One was women who, and the book describes this as peasants who were seeking work, and so probably what we would understand as women who were assigned female at birth who are sex workers. Onagata, who are people who are assigned male at birth who lived as a female, and wakashu, who were not women nor men, and their gender was tied to the kind of sex they had and the kind of partner they had. So the wakashu were often teenage boys, a man's younger and lesser powerful partner who was assigned male at birth, or a sex worker who was assigned male at birth. Sex between men in Japan at this time wasn't sanctioned, it wasn't against the law, but it was frowned upon because men who slept with men were seen as women haters. However, men were allowed to sleep with wakashu. Sex with wakashu was seen as a different category, and that was completely legitimate, and in fact, men were expected to be attracted to both women and wakashu. Wakashu also had kind of a different presentation and different personality imbued on them. They were necessarily submissive, they were expected to be devoted, but they couldn't expect the same type of devotion. And they had a unique hairstyle. They had a crown on the top of their head. The crown on the top of their head was shaved, and they had sections at the back of their head that were looped together. So they were readily identifiable as wakashu. Conversely, the women in the villages were not just sitting around. As their male partners were in Tokyo, the women would sleep with each other. And one of the ways that that's been depicted, and now we can go back and look at, get this from these depictions, is that Japanese erotic prints from these times in the villages show dildos and show women using the dildos together. And today it's hard to know whether that was a response to a male fantasy. Someone was thinking that that's what was happening, and so that's what they were depicting. But we do have records that's in Kit's book about there is some evidence that women were seeking comfort and even sexual relations with each other in the villages. But this changed, as happens time and again. At the end of military rule, a prince in 1868 took power and wanted to get Japan closer to European and Western ideals. And so borrowed gender ideals from Europe and reframed gender as binary and very set and defined only by genitals and by nothing else. So Iran in the 11th century. Kit includes some readings from a Persian philosopher that talks about how Iran at this time required that all boys wear white and that they avoid silk, and that women wear yellow, but mukahatan can also wear yellow. But mukahatan were not women. But they were allowed to wear yellow, and they were allowed other permissions and characteristics of women, even though they weren't women because they were considered women adjacent. They were allowed to paint their hands with henna. They were allowed to style their hair like a woman would in Iran. They were allowed to use women's jewelry. They were placed in between women and men at segregated events, because many events in Iran had women on one side, men on one side, but there was an area for the mukahatan. They were admitted to mukahatan spaces and also women's spaces. And this is really interesting and somewhat different than other stories that we've talked about here, because the reason they're admitted to women's spaces is because the mukahatan were thought to be asexual. They were presented in depictions and statues and paintings as having no penis and no sex. And so because their gender is designated partially by not having sexual desire, they were seen as safe to be in women's spaces and in mixed spaces. So Kit tells a really devastating story of early America in the 1600s, a really specific story about Thomas Hall or Thomasine Hall. They go by both names. There was Thomasine Hall was a servant, and a maid and the servant were accused of fornication, and the community became obsessed with determining whether the servant was a man or a woman. And this reached all the way up to a court case in Jamestown, and the evidence presented is really devastating. People were on the stand testifying whether this person was a man or a woman, and the evidence that they put into the record was literally, I snuck into this person's room, I looked under their clothing, and this is what I saw. And it's conflicting testimony, and it's an assault. It's awful that happened. It happened about 5 times, or at least 5 recorded times. And so that was all, that's admitted into the case. We can all look it up today to see this is what the testimony transcript looks like. And the truth is that Thomas and Thomasine lived as both. Until 12, they lived as a female. And then when their brother entered military service, Thomas, as they went as at that time, did as well, cut their hair, changed their apparel, decided they wanted to be a male soldier. And when they returned from military service, lived as female again. So the court heard all of this testimony and made a determination that Hall was both a man and a woman, which was great for Hall and what Hall, was asking for in the first place, except that it came with a dictate that Hall had to be clothed in men's apparel and female headwear with an apron. And so that actually destroyed the gender fluidity that Hall had up until this point felt was right for them. And so this is one of the ways that sort of the legal system really constricts who we are and aren't allowed to be. So this is something that I think a lot of people are familiar with when we think of gender expansiveness. Kind of 2 of the examples that come up very frequently are Two-Spirit people, as part of indigenous tribes, and hijras in India. And so those are the two that I'm actually gonna end on here. And it says 1980s, which is very, very recent. And the reason it does is because that was the time that the term was actually accepted at the Native American Gay and Lesbian Conference in Winnipeg. And there was a decision made at this conference that they needed an intertribal name to publicly reject the terms like gay and lesbian that had been imposed by white scholars, and they needed to create a Native-specific name. And so the name they came up with was Two-Spirit. Two problems that lots of scholars have identified is that, and there must be many, many more, but two that really remain true and were true in the 1980s when they adopted this term, is that it really accepts the colonial dynamic of classification, which a lot of indigenous people do not. And so, the practice and the insistence of naming and categorizing is not a native practice. It is a colonial and white practice. And then it also erases tribe differences. Two-spirit, even as we talk about and understand it today, is not just one thing. Different tribes kind of have different practices and different understandings of gender identity. So those are sort of the limitations of talking about Two-Spirit. But the understanding of Two-Spirit, as Kit talks about it, is that it's an incorporation of the male spirit and the female spirit. It's the idea that the person doesn't dress in women's clothing because of a personal preference, but because of a manifestation of the spirit. It is a deeply spiritual classification. This person doesn't have a gender because gender is human. Humans have gender. And so because this person is a spirit, we need to think spirit first and not flesh first. So it is a complicated and really, a really expansive and spiritual term. And oftentimes, Two-Spirit people take on special religious roles. A lot of times, you're revealed to be Two-Spirit in a dream or a vision. And a lot of times, the role that you take on in the community is in the margins in between two worlds. Because you are both male and female, you are also in between human and the sun. You're also in between life and death. And so the roles that you take on are things like life rituals, death rituals, religious rituals in which humans and sun are connecting. There is an indigenous author, Joshua Whitehead, that Kit cites in their book, in a book called Johnny Appleseed. And the book is about a two-spirit, queer, indigenous folk. And one important point that Joshua Whitehead makes is that we talk about Two-Spirit people a lot of times as mystic and shamanic and people that were, but they are now and they are coming. This is something that happens in the present. I mean, this is something that we do when we talk about Native and indigenous cultures generally, is talk about them as in the deep, deep past, when Two-Spirit people are here now and here in the future. As with other cultures, colonizers used Two-Spirit people as justification for genocide. They saw Two-Spirit people as bulking against the binary, and that was evidence that this was a culture that was less civilized. And so that was one of the justifications for colonization. And then the other example that I brought up that I think a lot of people kind of vaguely know about when we think about expansive gender is the idea of hijras in India, which come to us from a very, very old epic text, the Ramayana, which every Indian child learns in school at a very young age, which is that the god Ram and Sita were exiled to the forest for 14 years, and all of their followers followed them to the edge of the forest, and Ram turned around and said, thank you for your support, but men and women, you go back to the village, go back to your work. And so went into the forest, and when Ram emerged after 14 years, there was a group of people that were still there, were still waiting, had been waiting for 14 years, and they said, we are not men or women, and so we stayed. You didn't tell us to leave. So overwhelmed by that type of commitment, Ram, the god, blessed them with an ability to confer divine blessings onto other people. So hijras in India really live in a way that's a different unit entirely. They are considered to be called to be a hijra by a goddess, and that goddess grants them a particular power to, that's deeply rooted in spirituality. So they have the power to, essentially, I mean, they have several powers. They bless a lot of different times of someone's life that's auspicious, but primarily when it comes around fertility and infertility. When someone is trying to get pregnant, they will pay a hydra to come and bless them, and if a hydra feels like they are wronged, they will curse someone with infertility. And so these hydras often live together away from their family of blood, and they live in homes together and care for each other. Yep, sorry. All right. So Kit has, those are kind of closing out the chapter where we're going through different cultures. Kit has two chapters talking about, one is talking about clothing and fashion in Europe, and one is talking about theater in World War I internment camps. And I'm pulling them out sort of as greater themes because both clothing and theater, are not really limited. Both clothing and theater as ways to express gender identity and expression are definitely not limited to Europe and to the US. And so, first to talk about clothing. Clothing kind of, and this is, Kit's book kind of limits this to discussions of clothing in Europe, but really across time, across cultures, clothing has been so much more than just a covering. Clothing has been a second skin in a lot of cultures, and that's why there's so much uproar when people change their clothing, when people kind of cross-dress or dress in clothing that is not sanctioned for their gender. And so, across time, gender conformity is really to change yourself. It's to change your appearance, and hairstyle can sometimes go as far as changing your sex, especially when we're talking about a social transition. Sometimes that is the very first step, and sometimes that's the full step of a social transition, is to change the way that you are dressing and to change the way that you're doing your hair. And one example that Kit gives, which is a great example, is Anne Lister in York, who wore gender nonconforming dress, and Kit talks about the heavy, vibrant debate about whether Anne Lister is part of lesbian butch history or trans history. And the conclusion that Kit gives is really they're part of both, because they identified as someone who was assigned female at birth, someone who was attracted to women, someone who, in their understanding, married women, even though it wouldn't have been a legal marriage, but also saw their gender as very expansive. And this is a painting of Anne Lister, and saw their gender as only, wore exclusively what would be considered male clothing, wore their hair in an exclusively male way, and that was also a huge part of who they were. And so Kit's conclusion in this chapter is that, it's both. It's lesbian history and trans history, and we need to see them not as exclusive, but as kind of feeding off of each other and together creating a more expansive view of what gender is and what it can be. And I think Anne's sort of explanation or reasoning, or Kit's guessing of what Anne's reasoning was for wanting to dress in a gender nonconforming way, I think is probably really relatable to a lot of people who do so. What they've listed is that they didn't want to be seen straightforwardly as a female because they didn't feel straightforwardly just female. They wanted to use their clothing to attract women. They wanted to facilitate their active lifestyle, and was more kind of out and about and working in a particular way that would have been coded male, and so wanted to kind of facilitate that lifestyle and be taken seriously in their business. And they also just preferred the way that it looked. And so I think this is one of these are a few of many reasons why people across cultures dress in ways that they do. And theater is another. So Kit kind of focuses their attention on World War I internment camps and mentions briefly kind of at the end of the chapter that theater has been a way that people have played with and embodied gender in, it really, again, across time and across cultures, and we have definite historical proof of that at the very least in ancient Greece, in Britain, in America. There were plays that were entirely male, and so, but the cast was mixed gendered, and so people who were assigned male at birth were necessarily playing female parts. Oftentimes, these were teenagers and who were playing female parts. And literary scholars who have gone back to track their lives have said that for many of these people, for many of these teenagers, they lived as girls, both on stage and off stage, well into adulthood. This was a way for trans people to experience a different gender, to play with their gender, to feel what gender, to see if a particular gender feels right or not, especially at a young age. So the bulk of this chapter, though, focuses on World War I internment camps, which was a place where, during World War I, Britain rounded up a lot of German people who were in the UK and put them in internment camps. And there were many ways that in internment camps, you were living there with people who were assigned male at birth the entire time, and there was a lot of different ways that people kind of fostered community and attempted to still be light and entertaining. And one of those ways was to really indulge in theater and to put on plays. And these rehearsals would sometimes take all day, every day for weeks and weeks, and then there would be performances for weeks and weeks. And so people who were playing female roles sometimes spent the majority of their day in female dress and acting like they would expect a woman to act. And for many of these people, this bled over into even after rehearsals were done. This was a way that they could continue to be, either they could continue to explore or they could continue to be who they believed inside they really were. So this happens in theater, and the ability to be someone else is something that's very well understood, especially when it comes to gender expression. And there are a lot of reasons that people kind of turn to theater in order to play like that. One is it's trans people who feel like this is the safe way to be who they are. Another is that it allowed, in World War I internment camps, it allowed for sexual and romantic attraction between internees. Another is that friendship and romance were seen to be on a continuum for internees, and so this was a way to sort of express, you mean a lot to me, but in several different ways. It was also a way to escape. It was a terrible time, and so this was a way to really get as far away from what you know as who you are and what your reality is. And then the last is that for some people, playing another gender on stage and off stage was a social role that felt right to them. That we have some diaries, we have letters that say that people wanted to be women because they wanted to cook for their internees. They wanted to comfort them in a really difficult time. And so this was the way to play that role for them, was to appear as a woman. And then one other way that has been true also throughout many different cultures is drag. So drag as we know it and has been documented really got popular around World War II with drag shows that started touring the UK and became haven for gay men and trans people. And around the same time, similar shows were popping up in New York City. They were ballroom shows. Black and Latinx people were performing different genders in sort of underground shows. So this is one area that Kip mentions can be a conflict for trans people, in that drag fits under, in some formulations, fits under a large trans umbrella. Because it is people who, at least for a period of time, are performing and acting a different gender. And that, as the definition that Kit gives in the beginning, is trans. And when they're looking at histories of the past, people who are performing in drag would be considered trans history. But where it gets really complicated for trans folks and for trans activism is that oftentimes conservatives and transphobic people will take that and say that, well, we believe that trans people are just men in dresses. And we're going to use that justification to do things like put up bathroom bans and to exclude trans people from public accommodations. And so it in some ways legitimizes that transphobic rhetoric. So it's important, in order to counteract that, to really emphasize that drag performers are dressing up and trans people are expressing their inner selves, even if we can fit all under the same umbrella of varied gender expression and identity. But a lot of trans people do perform in drag, or at least do start in drag. And one reason is because it's a way to play with your gender. Another is that it gives you a temporary experience in a safe container, and then you can go back to what you know. And another is it is a great way to blur boundaries between male and female, human and non-human, body and art, in a way that really allows us to think about sex and gender very expansively. And then the very last thing I'm going to talk about is kind of the conflict between transness and intersexness. That's not, it's not an inherent conflict, but it is a conflict that comes up in a political way. So intersex is an umbrella term. It's a category of people whose body doesn't match with what is socially constructed to be male or female. About 1% of the population is intersex. A lot of people don't even know they're intersex. A lot of times what intersex means is someone has excess chromosomes, but testosterone and maybe an enlarged genitalia than someone who is typically assigned female at birth. It can be slight variations. It could be a difference in hormones. It could be difference in chromosomes. It could be things that have never been tested, and so you have no way of knowing. But sometimes when it's with differences in genitalia, you typically do know. And in the US, it's regular practice for medical professionals to do surgery on infants when they're intersex, as soon upon birth. It's not uncommon in the US, it's not uncommon across the world, it's also not uncommon across time. Intersex people have been considered to be supernatural or monstrous. There's a lot of text showing that intersex people were killed or drowned at birth or discussed as having a horn or wings or something that was more than human. So intersex people really call into complication our idea of normal bodies. It really highlights that we have these definite ideas of what is and isn't normal and which bodies should and shouldn't be. And so, we're forcing a lot of intersex people to conform to ideas of what a particular sexed body looks like. And the medical profession really is really kind of at the helm of an effort to make bodies conform. And there's also a racist history to this. I think that a lot of people have heard things like, eugenics really relied on ideas of certain, white people had a larger head size, and so they were smarter, and so that was used to justify a lot of horrific actions. The same is true for sex. There was this idea that white people were closer to the binary, that women were women and men were men, and people who were people of color were sort of closer to the middle of the binary, and that was also used to justify a lot of colonization and genocide. So the complication here comes in that intersex advocates today often campaign against the practice of surgically modifying their bodies without consent, whereas trans activists are campaigning for the ability to access gender-affirming care and medical interventions if they want it. These things are not mutually exclusive. I mean, the through line here is consent and the ability to do what you want with your body, but oftentimes the way that it's talked about can be pitted against each other. And there is a history that Kit talks about of trans people pretending like they're intersex in order to access medical interventions because that was the only way to get it. So, to conclude, today we're really in a hotbed of what I'm putting debate in heavy quotes because for some people it's a rhetorical debate and for some people it's their lives, where drag shows are being banned and gender-affirming cares are being banned across the country. And I think a lot of times when I'm talking about this, people often ask why this is happening, why the other side cares so much about policing things like drag shows. And I think Kit actually covers this a little bit, though not explicitly, when they talk about why the British government in 1871 passed a law in India that targeted hijras. And what they say, and what I think is true today as well, is that at that time the British government found that hijras were disruptive and ungovernable. They were street performers. They disrupted the ideals of what orderly public space is like. They created new visions of what a family structure was like because they lived together, and what care could look like. And they threatened an attempt to understand and thus to colonize a population. And I think that the same is true today. I think one reason why drag shows, gender-affirming care are being specifically targeted, why trans people are being targeted, is because they are disruptors, because they are sort of disrupting our idea of what gender identity can be, what gender can be, what an expansive world looks like, and thus are ungovernable. And so I think that these these bans are really rooted in kind of that fascist notion of really needing to control people, and it's very scary when people feel like they're uncontrollable. And so I think, one quote that Kit talks about at the end is, and they say, when trans lives are suppressed, everyone is denied an understanding of the rich diversity of sex and gender expression and experience that exist in human society. And the inverse is, of course, absolutely true. When they're not suppressed, everyone is granted a rich understanding of who we are and who we can be and what's possible. And I think that is the thing that the other side is really scared of us knowing. And that is it. And I think we're actually past time so, by 1 minute. So thank you so much.